So the one that I'm going to show you is king, rook, and pawn versus rook. Here we go, guys. What is really important in this position is to force the pawn to go in front of the king, okay? You don't want the king to be able to like go up and like bring the pawn with it. What you want to do in this position is that you want to like have the pawn in front of the king. The pawn has to advance in front of the king, because if you have the pawn in front of the king, then you're going to be able to check from the other side because there's no pawn blocking the checks. This only applies for the central pawns, the C, D, E, and F pawn. So we go rook g5, because by going rook g5, we are, you know, not allowing this king from going up. So if the king and the pawn are going to advance, the pawn is going to have to advance before the king. And then whenever the pawn advances, whenever the pawn is in front of the king, then we bring the rook to the other side. The idea being of just going for a million checks down here. If we were just able to go checks forever, that would be fantastic. But probably they might go king d5 over here. And whenever they go king d5, we go for the same idea. We just go rook g6 basically. This is a position that we want to remember. Whenever the rook is on the 6th file, we want to wait with it until the pawn goes to e6. So the idea is just to cut the king. So actually, even just to put the rook on g6 and just wait with it forever. We might have to do that immediately. So rook g6, now the king cannot go up. So the only way to advance is to go e6. Okay, and now we can see that the king doesn't have time to escape like this because this king is protecting. This is the position you want to remember. This one right here. Stop the king from going up, and then you just bring the rook to the other side. And then, you know, you're going to have a million checks over here. And if the king goes up here, well, then you have a check. King goes here, you have a check. King goes here, you have a check. King goes here, you have a check. You just check until the king is down here, and then you just, you know, go up and pick up the pawn, basically. So that applies to central pawns, that whenever the king and the pawn are next to each other in the 5th file, you just got to put the rook on the 6th and just stop the king from going up. Because if you allow the king to go up, then it's winning. Now you know that not a single one of you will lose this ever again. In a position like this, guys, now we're trying to defend, but it's a knight pawn. It's not a central pawn, it's a knight pawn. Now the difference between the central pawns and the knight pawns is that with the knight pawn, there's just one square on the left that the king can go to, so there's not as much space. That is the difference. So let's say that right now, the king wants to like start pushing, because, you know, you gotta push the pawn and the king, but we can see that now it's not really gonna be the same. Okay, let me just show you. Let's say that we would go like whatever move and they go for this. You know, this is not gonna be the same, because whenever this move happens, we cannot escape to a8 and, you know, try to get the king out, right? Because now there's gonna be a checkmate. So, and if you go like king c8, there's king a7, and then, you know, you're just gonna be promoting. So that is basically the difference between like the king being over here and the king being like somewhere else. So when we have a position like this, we're realizing that these going for these checks on the, you know, behind the king don't work, because the king will go to b6. You won't ever really be able to defend it. The way to save these kind of endgames, the knight endgames, is actually just to put the rook on the 8th file, like right next to your king, and just go back and forth. There we go. You just go back and forth. Boom! It's so easy. This is the easiest endgame ever. The only thing you do when you have a pawn that's a knight's pawn, you just put the rook next to the king, and you just go back and forth. There's literally nothing that you can do, because the king will never be able to like come in. This rook will never be able to like go to like this side and like start checking. Like if the king was like on c8 and d8, then the rook would be able to go to like a7 and like a8. But because this king is on b8, this rook will never really be able to go here. There's literally nothing. Like whenever this king goes over here, it's just important to always go to a8 and never to c8. Because if you go to c8, then the rook will be able to go a7, a8. But here, you know, there's nothing. The only thing that, you know, white might try is to go b7, and then you say thank you to your opponent because they lose the game. Literally, people have lost games like this. They've tried to push too much in this endgame, and they've lost in this way. So, you know, if they ever try to push with the pawn and the rook on a7, which literally is the only way to win, with like rook a7, rook a8, you actually lose this as white. You see? So you can't leave the A or B line with the king. Exactly. You always say thank you and your opponent makes you win. That is the idea. So in this position, if white goes a7, it's gonna be an immediate draw. Let's say that they would do it. This is like what a lot of people would say if they don't know this endgame. Then they would just say, have this king run to pick up the pawn. and be faster than this king, right? And you start calculating, bam, 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 bam. Who's faster? And you're like, okay, I'm faster. This will be a draw. It's like typically like what you might think, that you just gotta run the king to pick up the pawn, and it makes a lot of sense. But it's super important to know one thing over here, and I'm gonna show you an idea that you're gonna remember forever and ever and ever and ever and ever, which is that if you go king e7, this move loses due to rook h8. Rook h8, everybody. Why does this lose? Well, because white is threatening to promote right now. And if you pick up the pawn, then there is rook h7 check and you win the rook. There's a good trick to know in the endgames when you're playing with the rook pawns, basically. This is really important to know. The king will always have to stay in g7, h7. These are the only two squares to go to. You have to stay in these two squares. If you don't stay in these two squares, if you go anywhere else, you lose the game. If you go king f6, say that it was black to move, you go king f6, there's rook check and you promote. If you go king g6, then there's rook check and you promote. You go king h6, same idea. You go king f7, rook h8, promote. If you take here, you lose the rook. So this king can only forever stay in h7 or g7. This king can never move. What if you keep checking with the rook? Yeah, so if you keep checking with the rook, this king is trying to support, right? This rook cannot go anywhere either. Just like this king cannot move, this rook cannot move either without losing the pawn. So white's idea here is to bring up the king. What you want to do is white to move. Say that the king starts going up this way. If the pawn goes to a7, this is actually just going to be a draw due to king h7, king g7. So I can actually show you this. If the pawn does go to h7, you know, it's actually just show this. I believe that this is just a draw. I believe that this is just a draw because whenever the king goes over here, we will just check forever. We'll just get the king out of here. And we'll always put the rook over here. So whenever the king goes over here, we will just forever have these checks, okay? So that is the idea. If the pawn is on a7, then you just have forever all these kind of checks, you know, behind the king, and the king will never be able to support the pawn. So that's why the tricky endgame is when the pawn is still on a6, because now there's this a7 square that the king might escape to. This is basically the difference, as you can see. This is called the Vancura defense, everybody. The idea here is that the king wants to escape over here, put the rook in front, and do something like this. So that's why whenever the pawn is on a7, we can know that this is just a dead draw immediately. Let's say that it's white to move, and let's say that they go for, you know, whatever move, king f3 or something. Really important, you go rook f1, and this is once again, the Vancura defense. So rook f1, I remember when my dad taught me this. And the idea is that whenever the king goes to e4 or whatever, we have rook f6. Look at that. Now, basically, the idea is just that we are stopping the king from going to this sixth file, which was the dream of the king. We're stopping it from going over here. And if a7, then we're always going to have rook a6, and it's going to be the same idea as before. We're just going to go for all these checks. It's a draw. If the pawn is on a7, your king is on g7 or h7, it's a draw. Just say that, you know, the king goes to d5 or anything. We just go rook b6. Let's say that the king goes here, the rook goes back, and the king goes to b5 to support the pawn, okay? The king just wants to stay on this sixth file. Now, we start checking from the side. So now we can just check this way. Boom, 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 boom. And we just keep on checking. So whenever the king is on b5, we keep on checking. There's literally no way of stopping all these checks. You go something like this. Okay, now we're at the same position as before. We go here. Pawn goes to a7, we go to a6, and it's a draw. This is the Vancura endgame, everybody. This is the Vancura endgame. This is a really good one to know about. We've already gone through center pawns, we've gone through knight pawns, and we've gone through a and h pawns, basically.